Thank you very much. Debbie was talking about denial there. One of my favourite bits of climate change denial over the last year or so was the caravan park in the Lake District in England, in the part of England where William Wordsworth famously wrote about hosts of golden daffodils. But unfortunately, because the weather was so unseasonal and we'd had such a warm spring, all their daffodils died by the time the tourists came. So they planted thousands of plastic daffodils all over the caravan park. So it pops up in all kinds of different ways. So I'm going to give you an overview of the transition approach. And I wanted to just start by saying that this is really work that has arisen out of about 2.5 years ago, finding out about peak oil through meeting Colin Campbell and through the work of Richard Heinberg and the Post-Carbon Institute. There's a whole sort of movement really happening around relocalization and building local resilience, of which transition towns is just one part, and it sits very much within that context. There we go. So I want to start off by using these graphs produced by Bryn Davidson of the Dynamic Cities project, which I think give a very good analysis of where we find ourselves. We have running along on the horizontal rapid depletion and slow depletion. And we've heard over the last day or two about the likelihood of that depletion being far faster than most people would be thinking at the moment. On the vertical axis, he has proactive responses. That is, we pull together business, communities, markets to really engage with this challenge. Or we have reactive responses where we just sort of bimble along after the crisis, trying to fix it as we go. And he argues that if we have slow depletion and we don't do very much, then we have the kind of climate chaos burnout scenarios that Jeremy Leggett so graphically explained this morning. If we have very rapid depletion and reactive responses, then the likelihood is that we have the society really starts to hit some very major problems and even collapses, some people might argue. If we have slow depletion and we engage and we pull together, then maybe we can be looking at some of the more sort of techno-fix solutions that we've heard about this morning. But I would argue that actually with the rapid depletion that we're looking at, and if we can engage proactive responses, then actually we're looking more towards a sort of power down. Somebody mentioned this morning that we have reached the limits to growth. And I think we have to acknowledge that and to look at the downward side. It always puzzled me when I first found out about peak oil. It was like lots of people on the top of the mountain examining the top of the mountain as the whole downward slope stretched out before us. And so we're very much interested in what might that look like, and could that actually be a positive transition to engage with a depleting energy resource. Jeremy as well, I think, was the first person this morning to really try and weave peak oil and climate change together. And for me, it's going to be key to the solutions that we find. If we take a very pure peak oil perspective, like we had in the Hirsch report, we're looking at coal to liquids, gas to liquids, basically getting liquid fuels out of anything that doesn't move in order to keep all our cars on the road and keep liquid fuels going. If we take a pure climate change perspective, like we had in the Stern report, which actually said in the back of the Stern report, they say there is enough fossil fuel in the ground to meet world consumption demand at a reasonable cost until at least 2050. Which, of course, we all know to be nonsense. So it's only really, I think, when we start to overlap the two that we end up with solutions that are really valid. And this is what we're kind of starting to look at. This is, I think that when we start to overlap them, then the key thing that we're looking at is building resilience. And it's going to be the key thing of the talk that I'm going to go on and go through now, is the concept of resilience and how we have to be building resilience. When we look at purely a climate change perspective, then cutting carbon emissions is the imperative, and cutting carbon emissions is the imperative. But if we do that without also building resilience at the same time, then we leave ourselves very vulnerable to peak oil. So I think that when we overlap the two, we start to move towards building resilience, and that takes many different forms, which I shall go on to discuss. And of course, the work that we do in the transition network and through this whole transition idea doesn't operate in isolation. I'm not saying we can completely turn all this around just purely from a local scale. You know, we have things on the international level, like we need very urgent climate change legislation, contraction and convergence, oil depletion protocol, these kinds of things. On a national level, we need tradable energy quotas, carbon rationing, these kind of things. But what I want to look at is the local level, and to make the point that I don't think any of these things can happen in isolation. Governments are going to find it very, very difficult to impose carbon rationing and so on without communities who are really driving for that. And so my focus is really on the local level, because I think that's where this really has to start and be driven from. Now, Dr. Schlesinger said yesterday that to have real movement, the public has to be hit over the head with a 2x4. I think that in the environmental movement, particularly in the climate change movement, we come at this from the wrong way round. I think I liken it to trying to persuade a very reluctant friend to join you on holiday. You need to paint a very attractive picture of this beautiful taverna by the sea, and the sun goes down over the beach, and they do a lovely paella, and you can sit there. Whereas actually what we do in climate change is to say there's this really dreadful bed and breakfast near Torquay, and they have nylon bed sheets, and the toast is soggy, and it's really, we paint a picture of somewhere really terrible, and then expect people to not want to go there. The psychology is all the wrong way round. And I think that in order to do this, we need to be creating a really tangible, exciting vision and inviting people to embark towards that. Now, this idea of resilience is not a new idea. It's not something that's just been come up with. This is an aerial photograph of the town where I live, in Totnes in Devon, in the 1930s. And I'm not for a moment saying we should go back to the 1930s, but looking at this picture, some of the interesting things about it were, at this point when this photograph was taken, every business in the town was owned by local people. There was an economic resilience there that has been ruthlessly undermined in this country and in the UK, to the point where, you know, our high streets, very, very few locally owned businesses in the high streets. The other thing is, if you squint very hard, the bottom left-hand corner of that picture is all market gardens, allotments, food production happening within the town. At that point, pretty much all the vegetables and most of the fresh fruit would have been sourced from within the town itself. So this is in Homer Dixon's book, The Upside of Down. He says, in a resilient system, individual nodes like people, companies, communities, and even whole countries are able to draw on support and resources from elsewhere, but they're also self-sufficient enough to provide for their essential needs in an emergency. Yet in our drive to hyperconnect and globalize all the world's economic and technological networks, we've forgotten the last half of this injunction. And we saw, a few people have talked about the lorry drivers' dispute in the year 2000. It became very clear that one of the leading industrialized wealthy nations in the UK was actually about 2 days away from collapsing into very spectacular problems associated with lack of food. This is in Totnes before the railways came, and the analogy I like to use is that of a cake, in that at this time the cake was sourced locally. All the basic needs were produced locally, and what came in on these boats up the river brought in the icing and the cherry on the cake. Now we've changed that the other way around. We source most of our essential things from wherever in the world we can find them cheapest, and our local agriculture produces the icing and the cherries on the cake. It leaves us very, very vulnerable going into a time when, as we've heard over the last couple of days, the likelihood of shocks is increasing rapidly. We have very little resilience to fall back on. This is a man called George Heath, who used to run a commercial market garden in the middle of the town. A few people have mentioned the term food miles during the last couple of days. This was a system where they had food feet. This is the shop here, his shop in the bottom right-hand corner, and you could see from his glass houses in the town where his shop was. This is not a new idea. This is infrastructure that we had in all our towns and cities, which we now largely can only find by the names of the streets that we walk down in the day, which are named after what we bulldozed to make way for what's there now. Which is what happened here. He died in 1981, and it was turned into car parks. And in fact, when you look back through the history of the town, all of the major car parks in the town used to be commercial market gardens. And it's a pattern that you find all over the country. Now it's starting to be built on, so that potential is being lost forever. Of course, people have mentioned Cuba, and it's a shame our friend from Cuba couldn't be here today. But Cuba experienced peak oil. This is now downtown Havana, where the whole urban landscape has been rethought into commercial market gardens, organoponicos, one of the most intensive ways of producing food that has yet been developed. David Fleming, who spoke yesterday, writes, localization stands at best at the limits of practical possibility, but it has the decisive argument in its favor that there will be no alternative. That once we start to withdraw liquid fuels from our economy, then the resilience that we have around us is what we'll be falling back onto. And as the Hirsch report argues, we can't build that infrastructure overnight. We have to be looking at cutting carbon and building resilience, and we have to start that now. So the work that I do around this began when I was living here. Up until 2005, I lived very close to Cork City, and I taught at the college in Kinsale, which is just down the road on the south coast. We had the first full-time 2-year practical sustainability course running in the world, very successful. And in the year 2004, we first found about peak oil. Colin Campbell came in and spoke to the students, and we designed a project for the second-year students which looked at how the town might make the transition from where it is now in terms of oil dependency to oil independence, but as a positive transition every step of the way. We produced this plan as a student project. It wasn't something that was... we looked around, we couldn't find any examples of it already being done anywhere, so we made it up as we went along, and it really was just a student project. But since then it has become an extraordinarily seminal piece of work and has inspired communities all over the world to do similar things. And its basic approach was to look at a whole range of things, not just looking at energy. It looked at food, education, housing, health and medicine, economics, tourism, a whole spectrum of things, and how for each of those it then created a vision of how the town could be, and then backcast from there in practical steps. Since then, this idea has grown virally to the point where we've now set up the Transition Network, which is a charity which networks together, inspires and networks, trains and supports these transition initiatives around the world. It is now. This is after the first national gathering that we had a few months ago. So we've gone from a year ago, Transition Town Totnes being the first one of these projects in the UK, to there now being 19 fully endorsed transition communities around the UK, who range from the cities of Bristol and Nottingham down to small villages, down to peninsulas and valleys. And we have over 200, if you're going to start squinting to see if your town is on here, I think this presentation will be made available afterwards, or you'll find this on the Transition Network website. But there are now over 200 communities who are what we call mulling, which is where they've got all the information, they've started this process, they've started to form the groups. I've never been around an environmental initiative that has generated such momentum so quickly. And I think part of the key to that is that we present peak oil and climate change in a positive way as the possibility for this transition. And I think we've become quite successful at doing that. So 4 of the recognitions that underpin these projects are: the first one is that life with less oil is inevitable, and it's better to plan for it than to be taken by surprise. The second is that we've lost the resilience to be able to cope with energy shocks, and that we need to rebuild that resilience as a matter of urgency. The third is that we have to act for ourselves, and we have to act now. When I say we have to act for ourselves, I mean we have to act with the people around us and work on a scale that we can relate to. And the last one is that by unleashing the collective genius of the community, we can design ways of living that are more enriching, satisfying, and connected than the present. So I want to just run you through what we call the 12 steps of transition, which is the process that the various towns who are doing this process start with. First one, I haven't written anything else because it's just very self-explanatory really. There's not really a picture to go with this, but it's the first principle, which is that to start this process you form a steering group to drive it forward, but it's a steering group who from the beginning have designed their own demise into the process. The idea is that they begin this process and get it up to a stage where it can then be handed over to the people who are then really driving it forward within the community. And that's been a very important part of this process. The second step is what we call awareness raising, which is about raising awareness around peak oil and climate change, but finding ways to do it that don't lead to great despondency and misery. So we have lots of ways of showing films and doing talks which really present peak oil as an enormous opportunity. We also run a big program of talks that runs throughout the year. We work very closely with Schumacher College, who are on our doorstep, and there are some people here who have spoken as part of our program. So that runs throughout the year, and that's a very important way of keeping that awareness-raising process going. It's not something that you do and then it's done and then you move on to the next stage. It's the ongoing process of awareness-raising. What does that mean? Does that mean I've got 5 minutes? 10. Okay, so I'm getting flashed down here. The third one is about laying the foundations, which is that actually when you start this process, it's very unlikely you're going to be the very first people in the community who have ever thought of doing anything environmental. So there are lots of groups there already, and this isn't a process which is designed to sort of come in and replace or displace the work that other people have been doing. It's an umbrella to bring all those groups together, give them all a role, and to be able to drive forward much, much more effectively. So we co-organise lots of events with different groups who are in the town. One of the things that we do is to really try and engage with the business community, because without them this is really a waste of time. And we've been working on a process called oil vulnerability analysis with Simon Snowden from Liverpool University. We're the first town in the country to be doing this, to have trained up a group of people within the community who are able to do this. And we've now just completed the first 2 studies on local businesses, working with the Chamber of Commerce. It's a very, very powerful tool, because you work with business. You're not saying you need to change what you're doing for the good of the environment or for this, that or the other. It's bottom line, risk assessment. Where are you vulnerable to rises in oil prices? It's a very detailed analytical tool that explores where that vulnerability is, and I think it's going to become a very, very key part of this transition work around the country. We've been working with local landowners. We run a day called Estates in Transition. Obviously a town like Totnes can't be looking at rebuilding local food resilience without engaging with the land around the town, which would always have been the relationship that it had. So we ran a day with landowners and farmers that looked at issues around peak oil and climate change. Chris Grabowski, Jeremy Leggett came and told them all about that, and we explored the issues around that. The fourth step is that you have what's called an official unleashing, which is designed to be the historic evening that people will look back to as the point when it all began. So the mayor opened it, we had over 450 people came along, and it really generated a huge amount of momentum that has driven the whole process forward ever since. We've then formed a number of working groups who are the people in the town who are passionate about those particular subjects, and then they become the people who generate the visions and the ideas that then feed into the energy descent plan. That's been very successful, those groups forming very well. One of them, anybody who knows Totnes will know that we probably have the highest per capita psychotherapist ratio of anywhere in the country. So one of the groups is called Heart and Soul, which is really looking at the psychological aspects of all of this. Some of the stuff Nate was talking about this morning, which I think is really a key part of all of this. We use open space technology, which is a very powerful way of bringing large groups of people together to exchange ideas. We've run a number of those. They're a very powerful way of bringing all the passionate people about things together to form ideas, and that led into a lot of the practical projects that have arisen out of those. The seventh step is what we call develop visible manifestations of the project. And this is really important, that people get a sense quite early on that things are starting to happen. This is one of the projects that we have called Totnes, the Nut Tree Capital of Britain. It was going to be called Totnes, the Nut Capital of Britain, but everybody seemed to just nod wisely when we said that. And it's a food security strategy, and it's an awareness-raising strategy. You can produce more carbohydrates and protein with walnuts per hectare than you can with grains, and why they aren't a part of our urban fabric is beyond me. This is our local food directory that we produced of all local food producers and growers and value adders that was produced and distributed free in the town. And this is the Totnes Pound, which our chairman just mentioned. This is a Totnes Pound. The Totnes Pound, there was a little film that was made in Totnes about the Totnes Pound, and they asked a tourist who was in the town, have you heard of the Totnes Pound? Do you know what the Totnes Pound is? And she said, well, I would imagine it's where they take the stray dogs. But the Totnes Pound is a local currency which is designed to just circulate within the town. This is the second edition of notes now. The very first ones were the ones you see up there at the top, which was actually a facsimile of an 1810 banknote when the town of Totnes produced its own money. This isn't a new idea, but by designing a currency which can't leave the town, if you take it to the nearby villages, it becomes worthless. You have a very, very important tool for economic regeneration. We have over 75 businesses in the town who will now take this as being worth £1, and there are 6,500 of them in circulation. It's been a very successful project, and people are very, very fond of the Totnes pound at this stage. This is our Conservative MP at the launch holding fistfuls of them. We also do a project called Transition Tales, which works with local school children and gets them visioning forward to how life in a lower oil world might be as a positive step. Step 8 is to facilitate the great reskilling. I think that we have a very strong claim to being the most useless generation to ever walk the planet in terms of practical skills that we have that we will need again. And young people leaving school today have skills for a world which is passing very quickly. And so we run a series of courses and events. I run a 10-week evening class called Skilling Up for Power Down. And we also run a whole program of events that look at this. We train people in how to make films themselves, using digital cameras and editing themselves to put on YouTube so they can document this process in a way that is accessible to other people. We run courses on a whole range of things, seed saving, building, gardening, and so on, to try and get those skills out to people and try and reconnect old people with those skills with younger people who need them. Step 9, build a bridge to local government. How am I doing time-wise? 5 minutes. Oh, good. Okay, I'll relax a bit then. Step 9 is build a bridge to local government, which we now have the official endorsement of Totnes Town Council, who are very supportive, and of the Chamber of Commerce, as I mentioned before. And we also have been using World Cafe, which is a tool like Open Space, but as a way of bringing together people from all the different councils and our MP to explore the issues of peak oil and climate change and what their planning decisions might look like if they were based on those premises. Similar to what Ray Leonard was talking about yesterday with oil companies, we've started doing with local authorities. Step 10 we call Honour the Elders, which is where we do oral history interviews. And that's been a very, very useful part of it, to actually find out about how the town worked before oil, what people's memories of that were, and what might still be relevant to today. And I think there's something inherently respectful anyway about starting this process by going to the elders of the community and asking for their thoughts. Step 11 we call Let It Go Where It Wants to Go, which is that you can't control this process too tightly. If you start out, if you're a control freak, starting this process is going to just be a source of great stress. It's something that you start and it develops its own momentum and its own direction. We run a thing called the Solar Hot Water Challenge, which is a solar buyers club where we've now got 50 families signed up to putting solar panels on the roof. In a month, we have the launch of the Totnes Renewable Energy Supply Company, which will be a community-owned company that will be starting to put in place renewable energy infrastructure. It will begin by putting a hydro scheme on the river that runs through the town. We've set up a lending library in the local library and raised over £1,500 worth of books on all aspects of sustainability and transition, which are now in the library. We've been running NISP, stands for something dreadful, National Industrial Symbiosis Project. It's a way of bringing businesses together to swap their leftovers with each other, and we started running those, have been very effective. We're also very involved in the Soil Association's One Planet Agriculture Conference earlier this year, which was the most popular conference they ever had. Colin spoke and Jeremy Leggett, and it looked at peak oil and the implications for agriculture. They could have sold it out 3 times over. We've set up a car share club. We ran a Totnes International Music Youth Festival, trying to engage young people in this process as well. And the last one is to create an energy descent action plan, which we're now starting to build up to doing in Totnes. We have some funding to start that process moving. And we hope to create something that is a really exemplary plan, which really creates a vision that's very, very tangible and attractive, and then backcasts how we're going to get there. One of the things that for me is very exciting is a local young man who's just completed his MSc in sustainable architecture, who has taken the passive house model of zero energy building, but designed a local version using 80% local materials. What it means is that you can then backcast from there in terms of how you're going to create local industries producing natural building materials and so on. We also, such has been the demand now from different places, from the other transition towns, that we now run what we call transition training the different communities in how to run this process. And we had our first birthday party last week, and we had a fantastic cake with 3 cakes with teas on for Transition Town Totnes. So, in conclusion, I have no idea whether this idea will work in the long run. But certainly the indications are that actually, as a tool for engaging communities in this process, that idea of using peak oil as a positive tool for engaging people in change is something that has been very extraordinarily successful over this first year. It's a simple idea. It's about acting as a catalyst. It's not about coming in with all the ideas. A lot of the solutions are already there. We have to catalyze it and really enable that resilience building at a local level. So I run a website called transitionculture.org, which explores a lot of these ideas. And also, if you're interested, have a look at the website, and a book called Small is Inevitable, The Coming Transition from Oil Dependency to Local Resilience will be with you early next year. Thank you very much for your time.